Welcome to this free audiobook edition of Brand of Malice, The Cleric's Curse by Travis Kowlessar. If you enjoy the story and would like to support Travis, please consider buying this work in paperback, ebook or hardcover formats and checking out his other creative works on his website, traviskowlessar.com. This edition will be provided on his website in audio file format and also on his YouTube channel, which he kindly would appreciate you subscribing to if you would like to support him and keep up to date with his future works. Thank you for your interest in Brand of Malice. Please enjoy. Warning: this book is intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Chapter 1. Obscurity fades. Ever in silence, the Hillcrest village peeked from the mists which eternally drowned the moorlands below. A namesake for the loch hidden at its base, the humble hilltop village was known as Lacdorian, and it was home to a meagre, fragile and broken flock. Long had the last generation of its founders passed, yet the harrowing impetus rousing this defensive perch still lived on. It was a legacy carried forth merely through hushed fireside stories and threats from tired mothers, yet it still sent fear into the hearts of all those who heard it. The intricacies of his small village's dark history meant little to William. To him it felt like he was at the end of the world, far away from any of the woes that the city folk moaned of. He knew merely of his own peaceful lifestyle, nestled in an obscurity that only a truly mundane existence could maintain. "Are ye finished, son?" asked his father, raising an eyebrow as he watched William daydreaming. "Aye, father, almost there," replied William, snapping back to reality and hurriedly scooping the remaining dung onto his pitchfork before tossing it into his muck bucket. His father was an intimidating man. The 6'5" bearded giant was generally regarded as the strongest man in the village. Nobody dared cross him, including William. He was quiet, reserved, and well known for being an incredibly hard worker. He did his best to instill this same work ethic in his children through strict discipline. Sometimes William grew tired of the jokes about how he couldn't possibly be the man's son, considering his diminished frame and flighty nature. Despite not inheriting his father's stature, however, he had certainly inherited his work ethic at the very least. William's mother entered the stables carrying some warm bread for his father, who accepted it enthusiastically. She ran her fingers through his hair lovingly and inspected the bridle that he was working on. "How goes it?" she asked curiously. "Aye," responded her husband gruffly. "Will you have it finished in time?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder nervously towards the town's entrance. "I will if you'd stop pestering me about it," he answered in annoyance. She rolled her eyes as she continued to silently observe his progress. Today was the day that the town's one and only celebrity would be returning home for an extremely rare respite from his duties. He was a cleric of Bethmael, not that William entirely understood or cared what that was. All he knew was that they were in some way responsible for keeping the gateway to the other world closed. Due to their duties keeping everybody safe, there wasn't a corner of the kingdom where they weren't known and appreciated. The fact that such a high-profile individual could have come from their village made him the pride of Lacdorian. This would be the first time that the cleric had returned home in his life, and as such the whole village was abuzz with excitement. Just as William was finishing up mucking out the stable, he heard the telltale sound of Anne-Marie's front door closing. He tried to hide his sudden excitement from his parents as he awkwardly shifted his way towards the front of the stables. He sidled his way into eyeshot of the road where he could see her as she passed by. As soon as he caught sight of her, his heart skipped a beat. "Anne-Marie!" he shouted, waving enthusiastically as she came into view. She was carrying 2 buckets of milk hanging from a rod she had over her shoulders. "Good morning, William," she replied merrily. "That's a lot of milk. Where are you taking it?" he asked, looking at the hefty load she was carrying. "Up to your Uncle Wilton's cottage. He's making green cheese for Father Marcus's feast," she replied excitedly. "Oh, that's great," said William, allowing an awkward silence to form. "Well, I'll be off then," she finished before continuing on her journey. William waved goodbye heartily as he watched her leave. His parents both shook their heads at their boy's dismal courtship skills. "You should have offered to help her carry those buckets," said his father, without looking up from the bridle he was working on. "Oh, no, Anne-Marie's really strong. She doesn't need my help," replied William, missing the point. William's mother let out a sigh before kissing her husband on the top of his head and leaving the stables. William stared blankly after her as she left. "Why don't you take that manure up to your uncle's house now, then?" asked his father, nodding towards William's muck bucket. "Aye, father," replied William, perhaps over-enthusiastically. It was a little premature to be bringing the manure to Wilton's farm, but it would give him an excuse to catch up with Anne-Marie. He quickly picked up the bucket and headed for the stable door. "Don't forget to bring back fresh wood shavings this time," said his father gruffly as he was leaving. "Aye, father," replied William dejectedly. As he left the stable, he walked past his mother, who was now in conversation with one of their neighbours. Perhaps if he just walked by casually, they wouldn't notice him and pull him into some dreary conversation about village life. He ducked his head down and quickened his pace as he passed the two. "Willie!" his mother called out as soon as he was in eyeshot. He let out a quiet sigh. "Aye, mother?" he asked, after giving a polite smile and nod to their neighbour. "Are you going up to Wilton's cottage already?" she asked, looking at his not yet full muck bucket and raising an eyebrow. "Aye," he replied flatly. "All right, well, bring your sister with you," she commanded. "But mother," began William, wanting to protest with more vigour, but being afraid of doing so in front of the neighbour lady. "I won't hear any of your moaning, boy. You'll bring your sister. I'm sick of having her hanging around in the house, always reading those mouldy old books," yelled his mother. Her conversation partner nodded her head approvingly. "Aye," replied William despondently, before walking over to the window of their house and rapping on it forcefully. "Sasha, you're coming with me to Uncle Wilton's, hurry now!" yelled William impatiently. "I don't want to," yelled his sister from inside the house. "Mother says you have to, now get out here," yelled back William angrily, slapping the window for emphasis. After a loud moan of frustration and the sound of a book being slammed down, there was a moment of silence before the front door of their house opened, revealing his younger sister, Sasha. She squinted her eyes as they met the sunlight. "Hurry up," commanded William immediately. "Aye, shut up," yelled Sasha in response, putting on her boots as quickly as she could. She gave her mother and the neighbour lady a polite smile and nod as she passed them, and with that she and William set off on their short journey. "Slow down, brother," said Sasha in annoyance at the lightning pace William was setting. "No, you need to learn to keep up. You're not always going to be treated like a little princess, you know," replied William wryly. "Dad makes me do more work than any of the other girls in the village, and you know it," defended Sasha, hurt by his accusations. William rolled his eyes as he kept up his pace. After a few minutes of quiet walking, they had already reached the outskirts of their small village. "So, what were you reading today anyway?" asked William, beginning to feel a little guilty for snapping at her. "A book about the Knights' College and the Clerics of Bethmael, of course," replied Sasha, as though this should have been obvious. "Oh, so what about 'em? What makes 'em so special?" asked William. "You're 14, Will. Shouldn't you know this already?" asked Sasha incredulously. "Well, fine. Don't tell me then, you little runt," he replied angrily. "Sorry, Will," apologized Sasha earnestly. She had the privilege of attending their village's humble school a few days per week. The rotation of books that were loaned to them from the Mistfall Town Hall kept her well informed. This was a privilege Will hadn't had since his 6th birthday, when his father had begun putting him to work around the stables. Well, when they managed to close the gateway, they couldn't keep it closed forever, explained Sasha. William listened on quietly. The clerics of Bethmael needed to keep working away at it, she continued. Aye? For how long? Asked William, confused. Forever, she replied with a nod. What? Even right now they're still going? Asked William, his interest piqued. Aye. Apparently it's horrible work too. The monsters still want to get through. The book said that the clerics see all sorts of dark visions and hear horrible voices in their heads all day. Some of them have died from exhaustion because they nigh get a minute of rest, explained Sasha. William cast a worried glance at her. Are you sure these books don't have any of the forbidden knowledge in them? Asked William. Course not, she defended vehemently, despite a little worry being evident on her face. William looked down at his little sister and let out a sigh. Are you sure you should even be reading about this stuff? You're a bit young, aren't you? Don't be giving yourself nightmares now, said William, genuinely concerned about her. I'm 12 years old, William, she replied, rolling her eyes. William smiled lovingly down at his little sister. Aye, you are. So, tell me more about these clerics then. Does your book say anything about Father Marcus? Asked William. Aye, it does, replied Sasha excitedly. It even said that he's from a rural mountain village, she added enthusiastically. Huh? It didn't even say our name? Asked William, raising an eyebrow. Nay, it did not, she replied with a sigh. Just at that moment, the two of them caught sight of Anne-Marie up the road some way. There's Anne-Marie! Let's catch up with her, suggested William. Aye, agreed Sasha, joining him in hurrying their pace to reach her. Finally, having caught up, the trio set off cheerfully towards Wilton's farm together, babbling excitedly about the feast that was to be held in the village centre this evening. Before long they had made it to their destination, immediately getting stuck into their respective tasks. As soon as they'd arrived, Sasha had been taken off by their Aunt Genevieve, leaving William alone in the compost area to do his work. From here he could see through the cottage window to where Anne-Marie was talking excitedly with Wilton about his cheese-making process. Aye, this is lovely and fresh. Make sure to thank ye family for me, said Wilton, tasting some of the milk that Anne-Marie had brought with her. I will. Father will be happy to see our milk being used for such lovely cheese, answered Anne-Marie as she watched Wilton already beginning to prepare his station. Well, let's just hope that Father Marcus is a cheese lover, replied Wilton as he chopped some lemons. Even if he aren't, none of your cheese will go to waste. I'll eat it all myself, said Anne-Marie jokingly. Wilton laughed heartily in response. Why, girl, you're so small I can hardly imagine you eating more than a morsel. Either way, you'd better be careful not to eat too much cheese, or you'll end up looking like me, said Wilton in response, patting his belly. Anne-Marie laughed and shook her head. Aye, girl, of course I'm only joking. You can eat as much as you'd like, dearie. You'll always be a beauty. I've seen the way the lads in the village look at you, especially young William, said Wilton, raising an eyebrow. William blushed and hurried his shovelling. What? Me? No, surely not, replied Anne-Marie modestly. Aye, girl. Next time you see my nephew, you let him know I said hello, won't you? Asked Wilton, mixing his ingredients together. He's here right now, replied Anne-Marie, looking out the window to search for William and immediately making eye contact with him. He'd been caught staring. He stood in stunned silence for a moment before hurriedly trying to finish his job. Wilton poked his head around the corner of the window and waved to William, who waved back awkwardly. Why don't you go out and see how he's going? Asked Wilton. Aye, I will, replied Anne-Marie happily. William took a deep breath to steady his nerves as he anticipated her arrival. Wow, you're already finished. That was fast, said Anne-Marie, looking at his bucket full of wood shavings. Apparently not wanting to be labelled as an eavesdropper was a good motivator for fast work. "Oh my," said Anne-Marie before William could respond, looking over his shoulder and walking behind the cottage. "What is it?" asked William, following her curiously. As they rounded the back of the cottage and left the cover of Wilton's fruit trees, the view of the mists below the midday sun could be seen from their hillside perch. "It's so beautiful," said Anne-Marie joyously, clasping her hands together. As William walked forward to join her in front of the incredible vista, he had to agree, she really was. She suddenly turned to face him, blushing slightly as she caught his eyes. He felt like his heart had jumped into his throat as he took in the romantic setting that he'd suddenly been dropped into. "Did you hear what your uncle said to me?" she asked, her blushing intensifying. William stammered nervously. He quickly tried to wipe the sweat from his brow, spreading dirt over his forehead in the process. No, I wasn't listening," lied William distractedly as he tried to wipe his forehead clean. "Oh," she murmured, before reaching over and grabbing him by the hand that was rubbing his forehead. "Wow, look how many calluses you have," she said, analyzing his palm in detail. William felt his heartbeat racing. He hadn't had this much physical contact with Anne-Marie since they were kids. I do a lot of work," he replied, cursing himself and his rough hands. There was a long moment of silence as Anne-Marie began to stare up into his eyes expectantly. He could feel the heartbeat in his chest intensifying. He wasn't sure what she was expecting from him, but he had to say something, anything at all. She was staring into his eyes with such anticipation. "Did you know that the clerics of Bethmael sometimes die from exhaustion?" he spurted out suddenly. Anne-Marie had a change of expression into pure confusion. "What?" she asked, taken aback by this random outburst. "Yeah, the monsters from the gateway haunt their nightmares and won't let them go to sleep, so sometimes they die from exhaustion," finished Will, unsure even himself why this piece of horrible trivia was the first thing that came out of his mouth. Anne-Marie suddenly released her grip on his hand and took a step back. "I'm sorry, William. I thought... Your uncle told me something earlier, but he was wrong," she said, shaking her head again and beginning to shine bright red. "Oh, don't worry. He's wrong about all sorts of stuff," said William hastily, unwittingly making the situation even worse. "I'd better get back home. I need to help set up for the feast," said Anne-Marie, beginning to walk backwards towards the cottage. "Oh, yeah, of course. William almost said he'd come with her before he thought about it some more. She was the prettiest girl in the village, and he was a sweaty, callous-handed dung-tosser who was spouting out creepy nonsense about the gateway. She didn't want him to walk her home. There was no way. He had to use his brain for once. "I'll go and check on Sasha," finished William. She gave him one last wry smile before turning and beginning her trek back to town. Once she was out of sight, William turned around to face the view once more. "What is wrong with me?" He desperately wanted to scream, but instead released his woeful question as a dull groan. He paced around for a while, kicking stones and cursing himself before he caught his breath. He stared at the vista before him in silent reflection. It was time. Tonight he would do it. At the feast he'd tell her how he really felt about her. That'd make up for all of his awkwardness this afternoon. He nodded with conviction at his plan. As much as it pained him to imagine such a thing, he swore an oath to himself. He would follow through on this, no matter what happened. It didn't matter if she thought he was a creep for saying it. It was finally time that he showed some courage for once in his life. Chapter 2. The Feast of Bethmael. "And then she taught me about breaking rhythm," said Sasha excitedly, jumping up onto a low wall and miming the striking of an imaginary foe with a sword. "Rhythm? Are you sure she isn't teaching you how to dance?" William scoffed. Rather than taking the bait of his coaxing quip, Sasha stopped and considered it for a moment, "I suppose you're right. It is an awful lot like dancing," she thought aloud. William rolled his eyes. He desperately wanted to pretend that his sister was learning some kind of useless, second-rate women's fighting techniques from their aunt. In reality, he knew that Genevieve had learned her fighting techniques in the military. They were the real deal. The best he could do to mend his wounded ego over his little sister knowing more about battle than he did was to release the occasional wry comment. History books told of a time before the Great Catastrophe when women were excluded from learning such art forms. However, times had changed. Upon facing the literal end of the world, it was quickly decided that leaving any section of society unable to defend themselves was an unwise cultural standard. As their house came into view, Sasha ran towards their mother, who was sweeping the front porch. "Mother, Mother! You'll never believe what Aunt Genevieve taught me today," she yelled gleefully, running up to her mother and regaling her with excited chatter about her self-defense lesson. Rather than glee, William was returning from this trip still feeling rather glum after his unfortunate and confusing exchange with Anne-Marie behind the cottage. Arriving back at home only amplified his unease due to his proximity to her. Their two families shared one large house which had been split down the middle, with a thin wall constructed between its two halves. William's family had the left half of the building, including the stables. Anne-Marie's family had the right half of the building and a nearby field housing their cattle. The reality was that Anne-Marie's bedroom was separated from Will's by naught but that single, thin dividing wall. At any moment she could be mere inches away from him. It was hard to get her out of his head at the best of times, but with the feast taking place tonight, he was beginning to feel dizzy from thinking about her so much. "Wonderful. And how about you, Willie?" asked his mother, raising a questioning eyebrow. "Aye," replied William flatly. His mother and sister shared a curious glance with one another before both turning to assess him with excruciating focus. "Is he upset about something?" asked his mother. "Aye," responded Sasha, with a knowing nod. "What are ye upset about, darling?" asked his mother. "I'm not upset," responded Will angrily. "See, he's definitely upset," confirmed Sasha. "Poor boy, you haven't gotten yourself all worked up over the neighbour girl, have you?" asked his mother in concern. "Okay, now you're just trying to annoy me," yelled William. He was just about to evacuate into the stables when he suddenly heard a ruckus erupting from the village's entrance. As soon as he looked over to investigate, he immediately spotted what was causing the commotion. It was the fanciest brigade he'd ever seen make the trek up into their unremarkable village. 3 knights wearing intricate sigils on their gear led at the front of the pack. Behind them was a lavish caravan towed by 2 horses, with a squire controlling them. Sitting by his side was the man that they'd all been waiting for, the hero of Lacdorian, Father Marcus, Cleric of Bethmael. As soon as the villagers caught sight of him, they erupted into a round of appreciative applause. William still wasn't entirely sure why they were applauding, but joined in anyway so as to not stand out. Rather than the mighty hero cleric they had been expecting to see, the man on the passenger seat of the caravan looked positively sickly. He was wearing black hooded robes which stood out in stark contrast to the shiny pieces of armour his knightly compatriots were wearing. One look at the man was all William needed to see that he was clearly not healthy enough to support wearing a suit of armour. He suddenly felt his father's hand on his shoulder and immediately knew something was wrong. He watched on nervously as the diminished robe-clad man approached. On closer inspection, as his face came into view, William was again filled with a sense of unease. His skin was as pale as porcelain, and he had giant black bags under his bloodshot eyes. His long black hair fell over his face messily, and he seemed to be muttering something to himself. "Is that him, Father?" asked William quietly. His father simply nodded and tightened his grip on William's shoulder to implore him to stay quiet. The closer he drew to Will, the more he felt the grip of his heavy atmosphere tighten around his throat like a noose. It made him feel cold, lonely and afraid. It gave him a sense of despair and misery in his heart that he'd never felt before in his entire life. His father's warm hand on his shoulder was about the only thing keeping him from quivering in his boots from the disturbing aura cast off by the cleric as he slowly rode past. As the pilgrimage trotted deeper into the village, William felt relief flood through his chest. "Is he sick, Father?" asked William quietly, still not sure if his father was okay with him asking questions. His father continued staring after the brigade intensely without replying. His mother had been watching from the doorstep of their house and walked over to join them. "He's really back," she said quietly. "Aye," agreed his father, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. At this moment, William noticed Anne-Marie and her family also standing out the front of their house. They looked to be discussing the situation in a similar manner. "Well, it can only be expected," Sasha suddenly piped up, catching all of them off guard. "What do you mean?" asked their mother. "Most of 'em hang 'emselves," she finished flatly. Their father let out a dry chuckle at his young daughter's blunt outburst. "Aye," he said with an amused smile. William wasn't convinced. Was the man's anguish really so intense that they could all physically feel it? Just from being near the gateway, did all the clerics have an aura of despair like that? If that were the case, then why would anybody want to become a cleric of Bethmael? His mother and father began to head back inside to continue their respective duties. "William, after you bring in the horses, get ready for the feast. You're finishing early today," called out his father without looking back. "Aye," replied Will excitedly. He suddenly caught sight of Anne-Marie, who had been staring at him. She blushed and turned away when they locked eyes, walking back into her house hurriedly. Will let out a sigh. What had gotten into her? As he took the horses back into the stable, he peered over at his father, who was adding the final touches to the saddle he was making. He looked incredibly unsure of himself, so William decided to say something to bring his spirits up. "It came out really well. He'll love it," said Will supportively. His father let out a sigh. "I don't know if that man could love anything I made for him," he thought aloud. William realized now that his father wasn't merely worried about whether he'd done a good enough job. He clearly had deeper feelings about the situation than William could comprehend. He patted his father on his back before leaving the stables. It was time for him to get ready for the feast. As he retired into his home, his stomach was filled with a mixture of raw excitement and anxiety. Would he really be able to follow through on his goals with Anne-Marie, or was he just going to hide in a dark corner of the party like he always did? When their family approached the village centre, the excitement in the air was palpable. This was the least subdued William had ever seen his fellow villagers. Children danced about with colourful ribbons on sticks, playing happily all around the village. Everybody was wearing their finest Lacdorian festive outfits with beautiful braiding in their hair and polished boots. Many had even gone as far as to clean their teeth. Sweet smells of herbs and flowers emanated from the pockets of everybody around them, and although Lacdorians weren't the musical type, a traveller from Mistfall was even playing celebratory songs on a lute. "Wow, this is fantastic," declared Sasha, not knowing where to look first. It was immediately obvious that this was nothing like one of their boring old solstice festivals. It was as though they were celebrating something good happening, rather than just having a routine get-together. "Sasha, over here!" shouted some of the local children her age who were playing with marbles out the front of the school building. After looking to her mother and getting the nod of approval, Sasha ran over to join them. William looked up at his father, who was holding his fancy saddle and bridle awkwardly. He smiled when he beheld the giant man looking so stiff and out of place. He was perhaps the only other person here who looked as unsuited to these surroundings as William felt. "Oh, look over there," said William's mother, pointing to a table covered in gifts before grabbing her reticent husband under his arm and pulling him into the fray. Before he realized it, William was left standing awkwardly on his own. He put his hands in his pockets and sidled up to the town well. Since being put to work at a young age, he hadn't formed the strong bonds of friendship like the other village kids had. He'd also never developed the ability to just blend in with a crowd and approach people he wasn't close to. He suddenly felt a rough punch to his shoulder, pulling him from his thoughts. He jumped up, ready to defend himself before he noticed who it was. "Eric?" he exclaimed. "Well, don't be too surprised now. I'm a Lacdorian too, you know," replied his old friend. Eric was a few heads taller than Will and had twice his girth. The boy's large size had been a focal point of bullying when they'd been in school together, but looking at the giant lad standing before him, William doubted anybody would have the gall to pick on him now. William greeted him with the old handshake they made up as kids. "Of course you are. I'm so glad you came, brother," said William, letting go of him and beaming with joy. It was like Eric was an angel sent to save him from awkwardly standing on his own in a dark corner of the party. "Do you really think my father would miss an opportunity for free booze?" asked Eric, nodding over towards the keg stands where his father was already guzzling down a goblet of port. William hadn't seen either of them in years, and although Eric had grown quite a lot, his father had changed even more. Between his bloated gut, dark bags under his bloodshot eyes, his big nose and his dry skin, years of alcoholism had totally changed his appearance. "Wow, your pa really likes a drink, huh?" replied Will. Eric's expression darkened, and he shook his head in disappointment. Immediately realizing that he needed to change the subject, William slapped Eric on his shoulder again and smiled merrily. "So, how's things down at your farm? There's so much mist down there I can hardly see the moorlands sometimes," said William. "Aye, it's going well. Of course, with all that land we can keep far more pigs than we ever could have up here. Plus, we're on a trading route, so merchants from the city buy livestock and meat from us sometimes," explained Eric. This would have been a dull conversation to some, but to these two farm boys it was a rare opportunity to talk about their lives to somebody who understood better than most. "Did you see this lot coming through?" asked William, nodding towards Father Marcus and his cohort who were drinking together with the village mayor. "Aye," said Eric, scratching his chin and adorning an expression of deep thought. "I remember that look," said William with a knowing grin. Eric chuckled abashedly. "Go on. What are you thinking?" asked Will, looking over at Father Marcus too. "It's nothing really. It's just my great-grandfather's journal described this feeling is all," explained Eric. His great-grandfather had fought against the monsters which had spilled out from the gateway a century ago. He'd been a knight in the old world, and as such he'd been on the front lines when the great catastrophe had occurred. He'd kept a detailed journal and records throughout the Great War which Eric had inherited, and due to his studious nature, fawned over for years. "I bet your grandar met the clerics of Bethmael a bunch of times," replied William, nodding. "No, but that's the thing, Will. That weren't when he wrote about it. He wrote about this feeling when he were on the battlefield," Eric explained, again scratching his chin deep in thought. William was shocked. "Eh? What are you saying? Does it look like we're on a battlefield?" asked William, gesturing around at the happy townsfolk. Eric chuckled and shook his head. "No, brother. What I'm saying is that I think he might be on a battlefield of his own, even right now," finished Eric cryptically, narrowing his eyes as he stared at the cleric. William inspected Father Marcus in more detail. What had seemed like him mumbling to himself earlier, on closer inspection, actually looked more like an argument. His whole body was shaking, and he would occasionally bite his lips, which were torn up from having done this constantly. Every inch of his skin was covered in self-inflicted wounds, some of which he was inflicting right now by scratching his long nails deep into his arms, enough to draw blood. "Aye, "I see what you mean," replied William, a chill running down his spine as he beheld the battle this man was facing before his very eyes. "He hasn't touched his drink," said Eric with a nod. As William watched him more closely, he realized that the cleric wasn't actually speaking a word to anybody but himself. He turned back to Eric, who was still staring intently at the cleric. If there was ever something that Eric didn't understand, or something he wanted to know, he'd stop at nothing to find out all he could about it. He hadn't changed since they were kids. It was just in his nature. William smiled to himself. What if he went out on a limb for his old friend here? "What say before the feast starts, we take some seats close to them?" asked William. Eric cast a surprised glance at his friend. "Are you serious? I thought you'd want to be as far away from him as possible," he laughed. "What are you trying to say?" asked William defensively. Eric raised his hands apologetically. "Sorry, I didn't mean anything by that. Sure, you're on. Let's go find a seat near him now then," said Eric, raising his eyebrow as if daring William to agree to it. "Aye, let's go," said William, gesturing towards the man. "You lead the way, tough guy," replied Eric, pushing his shoulder playfully. William laughed, shoving him back before shaking his head as he began to lead the way. He swallowed nervously. The moment that he'd turned away from Eric and began walking closer to Father Marcus, his merry mood began to decline, as though all the joy in his body were being sucked out of him. He took a shaky breath and tried to steady his nerves. Was he just scared, or was there something more to this? He'd never felt dread like this before in his life, and the closer he drew, the worse it became. With Eric in tow, he was going to have to suck it up and act tough, but despite his manly facade, he couldn't ignore the feeling swelling in his chest. It felt like they were making a huge mistake. Chapter 3. An Insidious Proposal. As an introvert, walking towards the spotlight was daunting enough on its own. Throw in the fact that the man literally seemed to be emitting an aura of despair, and you had a recipe for making William's legs quake. He stopped on the spot for a moment as he drew nearer, and the choking atmosphere around him threatened to send him into a panic attack. Eric put a supportive hand on William's shoulder, filling him with some much-needed relief. "We don't have to do this, you know," said Eric calmly. Will turned around to look at him. He didn't look half as scared as William felt. How was he so brave? "Do you not feel it at all?" asked William bluntly. He had to throw his ego aside. He wanted to know why he was feeling like such a coward. I feel it," began Eric, deep in thought. "But this is the closest I've ever been to knights or clerics. Don't you want to know what knights talk about?" asked Eric, raising an eyebrow. William smiled at his friend. Even if only for Eric's sake, he wanted to continue onwards. He could see how piqued his curiosity was, and it was about time that Will started trying to get out of his comfort zone anyway. He turned back towards Father Marcus and immediately felt that despair begin to claw at his throat again. He didn't have time to worry about it, however, as out of the corner of his eye he suddenly noticed Anne-Marie. She was with a group of other teenagers their age, but she was completely fixated on William. He didn't let himself react at all. He didn't want her to know that he'd seen her looking, but knowing that she was watching him filled him with the determination he needed. He took one last deep breath before leading the way over towards the cleric's cohort and sitting down at the table at some empty seats nearby them. He left a couple of seats as padding between himself and them, as he was far too anxious to sit directly beside any of them. The truth was that nobody else in the village had the gall to take those seats either, not even the adults. At first, William was so focused on Father Marcus that he hadn't even looked at the knights sitting next to him yet, but as soon as he and Eric had sat down, the knights stopped their conversation and assessed them curiously. "Good evening," said one of the knights with a smirk, looking at the two of them down the table. William suddenly realized that he was being talked to directly by a knight. He snapped his head around to look at them. She was a redhead, probably in her late 20s or early 30s. When William had seen them all on their horses earlier, he hadn't even thought to look at them in any detail, as he'd been so preoccupied with Father Marcus. Good, stammered Will. He had no idea how he was supposed to address a knight. He didn't know the first thing about high society. He was a stable boy, not an aristocrat. What in the world was he even doing here? Just as panic was truly beginning to grip his heart, Eric suddenly piped up. "Good evening, Dame Azalea," he replied expertly, bowing his head politely. The knights exchanged some surprised looks, as did William. "You know us by name?" asked one of the other two knights in surprise. He had a ponytail and a goatee, and up until this very moment he had looked very bored. "But of course, Sir Ivar. Good evening to you, and to Sir August and Father Marcus," continued Eric, politely bowing his head to each of them in turn. Ivar and August smirked to each other in amusement before nodding their heads in greeting. Will followed suit and bowed his head politely to each of them, deciding to keep his mouth shut. "How is it that you have come to know of us?" asked Ivar, taking a sip from his goblet. "Word spreads fast around these parts. It's not every day we have 3 first-class knights and a cleric of Bethmael in town," explained Eric, laughing awkwardly. "Ah," said August, giving a knowing nod. It was only now that William was up close that he realized how intimidatingly large Sir August was. "I also purchased a college knight's ledger from a travelling merchant that told me a little about each of you," explained Eric. "I hope it's not one of those awful illustrated ones." "Is my nose really that big?" asked Sir Ivar, looking between Will and Eric searchingly. The two of them shook their heads vigorously. William knew there was no way Eric could have afforded an illustrated ledger. "No, sir, I recognized you from your crest," explained Eric, gesturing at the badge on Sir Ivar's chest that featured some kind of dragon, the meaning of which was lost on William. "What interest does a boy like you have with a knight's ledger anyway?" asked Azalea, clearly surprised that a commoner would spend some of what little copper they have on what to them would simply be a useless trivia piece. "Oh, I just think it's important to keep up with what's going on in Oxgate. Plus, what boy doesn't dream of becoming a knight?" asked Eric with a smile. August raised his eyebrows and nodded his head in approval. "You're also accompanying the hero of our village," explained Eric, gesturing to Father Marcus, who didn't seem to have been listening to the conversation and was still simply muttering to himself. William stared at Eric blankly. Was William supposed to have known their names and recognized their crests too? How was he supposed to take part in a conversation like this? He'd thought that they'd ignore them, and that he and Eric would just sit here and talk about horse dung. He was in way over his head. A hand suddenly appeared on William's shoulder, accompanied by one on Eric's too. "I am so terribly sorry about these two. They are lost and confused. Come now, boys, leave these seats for the adults," said the voice of the town's mayor, who had swooped in to do some damage control upon seeing 2 farm boys interacting with the knights. William immediately shot up out of his chair, seizing the opportunity to leave the terrifying situation he'd somehow managed to get himself into. "Come now, please do stay," implored Sir August, raising his hands in protest. William shared a confused glance with the mayor. Neither of them wanted William to stay here, but neither of them were going to go against the wishes of a knight. "I must tell you, my lord, these two are but lowly stable boys," explained the mayor. "Nonsense, you're all commoners. There's no difference," said Sir Ivar distractedly, swirling the wine in his goblet. The mayor clearly wanted to protest, but caught himself. "Take a look at them. This one's big, that one's small, this one talks, that one doesn't. They're a funny pair. I like them. Leave them be," said Sir August, laughing merrily. The mayor hesitated for a moment before removing his hands from the boy's shoulders. "Of course, as you wish. How about some more refreshments? The meal will begin shortly, but you can never have enough of our delicious Lacdorian green cheese," said the mayor, trying to pivot this awkward exchange into an opportunity to do some more schmoozing. "We know where everything is," said Dame Azalea with a polite smile. Again the mayor lingered for a moment. "Very well then, don't hesitate to ask if you need anything," he finished, bowing politely before reluctantly backing away and rejoining a nearby group of townsfolk. The three knights again turned their attention back to the boys. At the very least, they seemed entertained. "So, this won't do," announced Sir August, suddenly gesturing at them. William gulped nervously, unsure of what he was referring to. "How can you know our names without us knowing yours?" he asked, looking at Will and Eric expectantly. "My apologies. I should have introduced us sooner. I am Eric Lacdorian of House Rothmane," answered Eric boldly. There was a moment of silence as the knights shared surprised looks. "Rothmane?" asked Azalea. Eric nodded. "As in Sir Heinrich Rothmane?" clarified Ivar. Again Eric nodded. The knights shared astonished looks. "He was my great-grandfather," confirmed Eric. "I didn't know there were any Rothmanes left," exclaimed August, dumbfounded. "Yes? Well, after the war my great-grandfather was the last of our family line. He married a Lacdorian woman and settled in the moors," explained Eric. William was still in silent shock that this was actually happening. He'd heard Eric talk about his great-grandfather since they were children, but never did he imagine in a million years he'd have been noteworthy enough that even now modern-day knights knew his name. The idea of it sent a chill down his spine. He had an overwhelming sense of pride in Eric at being able to talk with these knights so well, but at the same time, how was he supposed to follow that? His fears were suddenly amplified when Sir August turned his attention to William. "Well, do you talk?" asked Sir August. William stammered awkwardly as his mouth tried to find words to say. "Aye," he spurted out finally. Azalea and August both let out a chuckle. "Aye?" spluttered Ivar incredulously. "They only say yes in Oxgate," said Eric quietly. "Oh, yes," corrected William, shining bright red with embarrassment. Again the knights chuckled. "So, how about you? Are you from some famous old house that we thought had disappeared? Are you, perhaps, Lord William of House Ashdown?" asked Ivar, smirking at his own joke. No, sir. I'm just William Lacdorian," answered Will with a polite nod, missing the joke. "Oh, I like him," said Azalea with a warm smile. At this moment, suddenly someone brushed against William's right shoulder. When he turned to see who it was, he felt a jolt run through his body. There stood Anna-Marie, shining bright red with embarrassment. As terrified as she looked, she also wore an expression of determination. She curtsied politely to the three knights and Father Marcus before taking the empty seat next to William. "Another one?" asked Ivar, intrigued. Good evening," stammered Anne-Marie, trying to sound confident and refined, despite her anxiety being evident. Azalea tilted her head, giving Anne-Marie a warm smile. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked, leaning her head on her hands as she looked at the three of them, enamoured. "Is it perhaps Lady Victoria of House Bellamour?" asked Ivar, again chuckling at his own quip. "No, my lord, it's Anne-Marie Lacdorian," she stammered, missing the joke just as Will had. Of all the people in this village that would have the courage to come and join them here, he never imagined that it would be Anne-Marie. He smiled adoringly at her, his love for her swelling in his chest. "No!" exclaimed Marcus suddenly, slamming his fist on the table, causing everybody to jump. The knights shared a concerned glance with one another. Will wasn't sure what to do. The man's outburst ended as quickly as it started, with him returning to mumbling under his breath and scratching at his arms. Will and Anne-Marie shared terrified looks with one another. When he turned to look at Eric, his friend simply shook his head and shrugged. There was an awkward moment of silence, as nobody knew how to recover the conversation, which had at this point been completely lost. At that very moment, a parade of the village's best cooks suddenly emerged from the crowd, beginning to bring their various platters of food to the giant series of dining tables that had been erected down the village centre. A number of the townsfolk released a dull applause as the food was uncovered and everybody began meandering their way towards the tables to claim a seat. Amid the chaos, William noticed the knights leaning towards each other and having a hushed conversation. They kept glancing over towards Marcus and gesturing towards him in subtle ways. "Do you see it?" whispered Eric suddenly in William's ear. He turned to look at his friend searchingly. Eric subtly pointed his attention at Father Marcus's leg, which they could see poking out from the corner of the table from their vantage point. He'd taken the knife from his belt and dug it solidly into his own thigh. He was twisting it back and forth in the wound. If it weren't for his dark robes, the blood running down his leg would have been obvious for all to see. William felt goosebumps run down his arms. He'd never seen anything like this in his life. "Why would he do that?" whispered William shakily, terrified of what he was seeing. Eric shook his head in response, a look of concern covering his face. "Hey," said Azalea all of a sudden, pulling William's attention back to the knights. Despite the cleric's leg being out of her line of sight, she'd clearly noticed how uncomfortable the two of them were becoming. "What's the best thing to eat here?" she asked with a smile. She was obviously trying to distract them. It hadn't worked particularly well on William or Eric, who weren't sure whether to keep looking at Father Marcus butchering his own leg or at Azalea. Fortunately, Anne-Marie piped up to answer. "Definitely the pork belly," she replied enthusiastically. William smiled adoringly at her once again. She was too modest to mention her family's contributions to the feast, but he wasn't. "Anne-Marie's family has prepared delicious steaks, and the cheese was made with milk from their cows too," added William, too proud of her to hold back. She blushed with embarrassment. Azalea raised a curious eyebrow. "Is that so?" she asked, looking between the two of them. Suddenly the mayor burst back out of the crowd behind William once more. "Esteemed guests, please don't trouble yourselves to fill your own plates. Allow me to supply you with the finest selection of the delicacies our village has to offer," he announced with a slight bow. "We want the steak," said August bluntly. "Of course, my lord," replied the mayor, surprised by his immediate choice. "And the pork belly," added Azalea with a nod to Anne-Marie. "What did your families prepare?" asked Sir Ivar. "The pork was actually raised on my farm," replied Eric with a smile. The attention suddenly fell back on William once more. My family? Well, my father made the saddle and bridle over on the table of gifts," replied William with a shy nod. "Oh, that?" asked Ivar with a raised eyebrow, tilting his head to look over at it. William wasn't sure whether Ivar was impressed or simply amused by his father's work. His instinct to defend his father suddenly kicked in. "It bears the sigil of Lackdorian, so that Father Marcus knows that we're always thinking of him," proclaimed William passionately. Okay, replied Ivar with a chuckle, raising his hands defensively. "Just give me whatever you think is best then, Mayor," finished Ivar, turning his attention back to his drink. "Very well. And for you, sir, which of our village's fine delicacies do you desire?" asked the mayor, swallowing nervously as he turned to face Father Marcus. The cleric shook slightly upon being addressed, his hand, which had been gripping the handle of his knife, releasing. It was almost like he was fighting a losing battle against his own body's movements. His left arm slowly rose up, his hand taking the shape of a pointing finger. His right arm suddenly jolted out and grabbed onto his left robe sleeve, seeming to feebly attempt to pull it back down. Unfortunately, he failed, and as his arm finally found its resting point extending out in front of him, a shock ran through William's entire body. Marcus was pointing directly at Anne-Marie. There was a moment of complete silence as a shocked realization washed over the entire group. Even the babbling mayor wasn't sure of what to say. Anne-Marie grabbed onto William's knee for support under the table. She must have been absolutely terrified by what was unfolding. As anxious as he felt, at this moment William knew he had to be there for her. He placed his hand supportively over hers. This was like a nightmare. "You want the girl?" asked the mayor in confusion. Father Marcus's head jolted left and right awkwardly for a moment before slowly dropping into a confirming nod. There was another chilling silence as realization ran over everybody. "Wife," he croaked awkwardly before suddenly biting down on his tongue violently and causing himself to wince. Anne-Marie's grip on William's knee tightened. In Lacdorian culture, usually marriages were arranged by parents. A bold proposal of this nature was extremely rare, but not entirely unheard of. Before anybody could respond, Anne-Marie suddenly got up to her feet. "I'm sorry, I have to eat with my family," she announced, giving a polite curtsy and then scurrying off into the crowd. William turned back to the knights, who were all looking as surprised as William felt. He looked to Eric, who widened his eyes and nodded in her direction, implying that Will should chase after her. "Aye!" spurted out William impolitely, bursting up from his chair. He bowed awkwardly at the knights and then ran after Anne-Marie as quickly as he could. How had such a festive and joyful night taken such a dark turn so suddenly? William felt utterly sick. The horror which gripped his stomach threatened to make him gag. Surely this couldn't be happening. Surely Anne-Marie wouldn't really be wed to this dark and terrifying man. William had to find her. He had to help her. He couldn't imagine how she was feeling right now. As he pushed his way through the crowd searching for Anne-Marie, he swore to himself that no matter what, he wouldn't let this happen. William searched for Anne-Marie everywhere that he could. She'd said that she needed to be with her family, but when he'd found them eating merrily at the feast, she was nowhere to be seen. As panic was beginning to set in, a thought suddenly struck him. When they were children, whenever Anne-Marie was upset, she'd hide out behind the schoolhouse. He took off towards the schoolhouse, running straight past and around the side of the building. A feeling of relief flooded through his chest as soon as he spotted the dark outline of Anne-Marie sitting on a large rock. He took a deep breath and approached her slowly. "Anne-Marie," he said softly. At first she inhaled sharply in surprise, but as he drew closer, she stood to see him. "William?" she asked, hurriedly trying to wipe tears away from her eyes. After a moment of silence, she ran over to him and caught him in a hug, bursting into tears and crying into his chest. For a brief moment, William wasn't sure whether it would be okay to hug her back, but then his instincts kicked in. He hugged her warmly and rubbed her back soothingly. This was one of the rare circumstances where the silence formed by his inability to find the right words to say would be beneficial. "I was so scared," she cried into his chest. "I," agreed Will, continuing to simply hold her gently. "I didn't know what to do," she wept. "Aye," said Will simply once more. There were a few moments of silence while William quietly consoled her. She pulled back and looked up into his eyes. "Were you not scared of him, William?" she asked. He knew exactly how she felt. He'd felt the same way when he'd seen Eric's stoic face when they'd first drawn near to Father Marcus. "I was petrified," admitted William. A small, relieved smile appeared on Anne-Marie's face. "Why would he want me to be his wife?" she asked earnestly. Here it was. William felt his heart skip a beat as he noticed his cue. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. "Because you're beautiful," he replied honestly. Anne-Marie was taken aback. She looked up into his eyes to see if he was being serious. "Any man would be lucky to have you as his wife," he admitted, realizing that he might be overstepping the mark a little now. Anne-Marie began to blush and buried her face in his chest again. At first, William thought she was sobbing as he felt her body under his hand, but then he realized she was giggling. "I thought you hated me," she said, pulling away from his chest again and looking up at his face. William was relieved to see her panic-stricken expression now replaced by a cute smile. "Hated you? Why would I hate you?" he asked in surprise. He had no idea how he'd given her that idea. "Well, maybe not hated, but—" "Never mind," she said, giggling again. There was a quiet moment as the two smiled and pulled apart slightly as they suddenly noticed how close they were. William blushed and averted his gaze. His heart was pounding in his chest, but the fear and worry that he was feeling mere minutes ago was now replaced by a warm, giddy feeling that made his whole body tingle. "Are you going to eat with your family now?" asked William. Anne-Marie's face darkened slightly, and she shook her head. "I don't want to talk to them," she said with a frown. "Why not? I just saw them. They're having a great time," said William. Anne-Marie let out a sigh, sitting back down on the rock she'd been perched on before. "What do you think they'll say?" she asked quietly. Will stared back at her blankly. "About what?" he asked, so enraptured with her that he'd almost forgotten how they ended up here. "He's our village's hero, Will," she said despondently. Suddenly, it dawned on him what she meant. Arranged marriages were the standard in Lacdorian culture. If her parents decided to accept his proposal on her behalf, it would be an extremely long and arduous battle for her to fight against it. They'd all seen it happen before, but it was always a messy and highly emotional affair, which rarely, if ever, ended in the daughter's favour. "Nobody is going to take his proposal seriously. He's a fruitcake!" exclaimed Will, realizing that he was woefully unequipped to be having such a deep and important conversation. "It don't matter," she replied pessimistically. "It do," insisted Will, trying to be convincing. "It don't!" she yelled passionately, tears beginning to fall from her eyes again. William stood in stunned silence for a moment, not sure of what to say. He was clearly not going to be able to convince her to think more optimistically about this with his words. A minute ago, he'd managed to put a smile on her face with his actions. Could he pull it off again? "Okay, wait here," said William, beginning to back away towards the feast. "What?" she yelped in surprise as she watched Will's sudden withdrawal. "Where are you going?" she called out. "Just wait there, I'll be back, I promise," replied Will, breaking into a run. He pushed his way back to the dining table, grabbing 2 plates and filling them with all of Anne-Marie's favourite foods. The pork belly from Eric's farm, the steak from her cows, even the roasted carrots he remembered her saying she liked several solstices ago. Once both plates were full, he snatched up a lantern and ran back to her. He smiled as he saw her silhouette still patiently waiting on the rock behind the school. As soon as she caught sight of him, her face turned from sorrow to surprise. "Come over here," he said, putting both plates down on the grass beside the lantern and sitting down. "William," said Anne-Marie, walking over and sitting down beside him. "Come on, we can't let all this delicious food go to waste," said William, taking a huge bite of pork. "Oh my! Are those Mrs. Geraldine's carrots? How did you know I loved those?" she asked in surprise. William blushed as he thought about how to explain that he remembered every little thing she'd ever said to him. "Thank you, William," she said earnestly with a grateful smile. For a moment, William was lost in her eyes before he snapped back to reality. "Come on then, dig in," he said with a laugh. So there it was, sitting in the dim candlelight behind the village's school, that William and Anne-Marie ate their feast. As they ate, talked and laughed together under the moonlight of a peaceful night, their worries were forgotten, at least for now.